The rusty Honda Civic wheezed to a stop at the traffic light, its exhaust pipe coughing black smoke into the crisp morning air. Behind the wheel, Sarah Chen adjusted the duct tape holding her side mirror in place and pretended not to notice the way people in the adjacent lanes were staring at her beat-up car with a mixture of pity and disgust. The vehicle's paint had long since faded from whatever color it might have been originally to a patchy brown that reminded her of autumn leaves after they'd been trampled underfoot for weeks. In the gleaming silver Porsche 911 Turbo S beside her, Marcus Wellington III rolled down his window and made an exaggerated show of waving his hand in front of his nose, as if the mere sight of Sarah's car was producing an offensive odor. His perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning sunlight, and his custom-tailored Italian suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. The Rolex Submariner on his wrist glinted as he gestured dramatically to his passenger, an equally well-dressed woman with surgically enhanced features and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Good God, Veronica," Marcus said loudly enough for Sarah to hear through her partially open window, "look at that absolute disaster of a vehicle. How is that thing even legal to drive on public roads? It's practically a health hazard. The owner must be completely destitute to be driving something so pathetically embarrassing." Veronica Blackstone, daughter of a prominent real estate mogul and Marcus's on-and-off girlfriend of 3 years, tilted her head to get a better look at Sarah's car. Her perfectly applied makeup created a mask of disdain as she surveyed the Honda's numerous dents, the passenger door that was clearly a different shade than the rest of the car, and the rear bumper that was held on with what appeared to be a combination of zip ties and prayer. "Oh my goodness, Marcus, you're absolutely right," Veronica replied in her artificially sweet voice that dripped with condescension. "I can't believe someone would actually be seen in public driving that piece of junk. Look at those hubcaps, or wait, are those even hubcaps? They look like metal plates from a junkyard. And is that duct tape holding the mirror on? How utterly tragic." Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, but her expression remained carefully neutral. She'd learned long ago not to react to such comments, having heard variations of them countless times before. The irony of the situation was almost amusing, if it weren't so frustrating. These two privileged individuals, sitting in their expensive German engineering marvel, had absolutely no idea who they were mocking. Marcus wasn't finished with his performance. He revved his Porsche's engine unnecessarily, the perfectly tuned V6 twin-turbo producing a sound that was undeniably impressive. "Listen to that, sweetheart," he said to Veronica while making sure his voice carried to Sarah's car. "That's what a real engine sounds like. Not like whatever dying animal is trapped under the hood of that embarrassment over there." The light turned green, and Marcus gunned his Porsche forward with a dramatic squeal of tires, leaving Sarah's Honda in a cloud of his exhaust. But traffic was heavy this morning, and within a few hundred yards, both cars found themselves stopped at another red light. This time, Marcus had ended up directly behind Sarah's vehicle, giving him an even better view of its numerous imperfections. "Look at that rear end," Marcus continued his commentary, apparently finding great entertainment in degrading a stranger's vehicle. "The exhaust pipe is literally held on with coat hangers." "Coat hangers? And what is that noise it's making?" "It sounds like a dying walrus with emphysema. How does someone let their car get to this condition? Don't they have any self-respect whatsoever?" Sarah caught Marcus's eye in her review mirror and saw him shaking his head in theatrical disgust. She could see him saying something to Veronica, both of them laughing as they pointed at various aspects of her car's deteriorated condition. The Honda's engine did indeed sound rough, coughing and sputtering like an old man with a lifetime of cigarette damage, and Sarah knew that the casual observer would have every reason to assume the vehicle was on its last legs. What Marcus and Veronica couldn't see, however, was the small smile playing at the corners of Sarah's lips. They also couldn't see the discreet earpiece she was wearing, through which her assistant Jennifer was currently providing her with updates on her various business holdings. The morning report was particularly good. Her latest acquisition of a struggling tech company was showing promising signs of recovery after only 3 months under her guidance, and her real estate portfolio had increased in value by another $12 million overnight due to some favorable zoning changes in downtown Seattle. Jennifer's voice crackled softly through the earpiece. "I have the final paperwork ready for the Blackstone Properties acquisition. Should I proceed with filing the documents this afternoon?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. Blackstone Properties, as in Veronica's father's company, which had been hemorrhaging money for the past 18 months due to a series of poor investment decisions and some rather spectacular development failures. Richard Blackstone had been desperately seeking a buyer, though he'd been trying to keep the negotiations private to avoid damaging his family's reputation. What he didn't know was that the mysterious shell corporation that had been offering to buy his failing empire was actually one of Sarah's many business entities. "Yes, Jennifer, go ahead and file everything," Sarah said quietly, knowing that Marcus and Veronica were too busy laughing at her car to notice she was talking. "And make sure to schedule the press conference for next Friday. I think it's time to make the acquisition public." The light turned green again, and this time Sarah decided to have a little fun. She let her Honda lag behind as Marcus zoomed ahead in his Porsche, but at the next intersection, she took a right turn onto Meadowbrook Lane. Marcus, caught up in his conversation with Veronica about their plans for the weekend in the Hamptons, didn't notice that the object of his mockery had turned off the main road. Meadowbrook Lane was one of the most exclusive streets in the entire metropolitan area, lined with massive estates hidden behind imposing gates and manicured hedges. The properties here started at $15 million and went up from there, with some of the mansions selling for prices that could fund small countries. It was the kind of neighborhood where celebrities, tech moguls, and old money families maintained their primary residences, far from the prying eyes of the general public. Sarah drove slowly down the tree-lined street, her Honda looking increasingly out of place among the perfectly landscaped driveways that offered glimpses of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and other exotic vehicles. She pulled up to an ornate set of wrought iron gates that were easily 12 feet tall and decorated with intricate metalwork that had been crafted by artisans in Italy. The gates were set into a stone wall that stretched as far as the eye could see in both directions, protecting the privacy of whoever lived beyond. Sarah pressed a button on a small remote clip to her sun visor, and the massive gates began to swing open with the silent precision of perfectly maintained machinery. As she drove through the entrance, motion sensors triggered subtle lighting along the driveway, and hidden cameras discreetly tracked her vehicle's progress. The driveway itself was made of hand-cut Belgian stone and curved gracefully through a landscape that looked like it had been designed by the same person who had created the gardens at Versailles. After nearly a quarter-mile of driving through her own property, Sarah's Honda finally came to a stop in front of a structure that defied easy description. It wasn't quite accurate to call it a garage, though that was technically its function. The building was larger than most people's entire homes, constructed of the same imported stone as the main house, with soaring glass panels that allowed natural light to flood the interior. Architectural spotlights were positioned to highlight the building's elegant lines, and the overall effect was more reminiscent of a modern art museum than a place to store vehicles. Sarah pressed another button on her remote, and one of the building's glass panels slid upward with mechanical precision. As she drove her Honda inside, the contrast between her humble vehicle and its surroundings became almost comical. The floor was made of polished concrete that reflected like a mirror, and the walls were lined with climate-controlled display areas. Each parking space was actually more like an exhibition area, with individual lighting systems and information displays showing the specifications and history of each vehicle. But it was the vehicles themselves that would have left Marcus and Veronica speechless. Sarah parked her Honda in the one empty space, right between a pristine 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB F4 and a brand new McLaren P1 that still had the manufacturer's protective coverings on its seats. As she stepped out of her car, Sarah surveyed her collection with the satisfaction of someone who had spent years carefully curating each acquisition. To her left sat a row of Lamborghinis, a classic Miura in stunning orange, a modern Aventador SVJ in matte black, and a limited edition Centenario that was one of only 20 ever produced. Beyond those were the Ferraris, not just any Ferraris, but some of the rarest and most valuable examples ever created. A 1962 250 GTO, worth roughly $50 million, occupied a place of honor in the center of the collection. Next to it sat a LaFerrari, a 2020 SF90 Straydale, and a vintage 288 GTO that Sarah had purchased from a private collector in Monaco. The Porsche section would have made Marcus weep with envy. Sarah owned not just one 911 Turbo S like his, but three, in different configurations and colors. There was also a 918 Spider, a Carrera GT, and a vintage 959 that she'd had completely restored by the factory in Stuttgart. A collection of classic American muscle cars occupied another section, a 1970 Plymouth Acuda in plum crazy purple, a 1969 Dodge Charger RT, and a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427 that could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. But perhaps the most impressive section contained the hypercars, vehicles so exclusive and expensive that they were essentially automotive jewelry. A Bugatti Chiron Supersport sat next to a Koenigsegg Jesko, which was positioned alongside a Pagani Huayra BC. The crown jewel of this section was a McLaren F1, one of only 106 ever produced, and widely considered the greatest supercar ever created. Sarah walked through her collection, running her fingers along the perfect paint jobs and admiring the way the carefully positioned lighting brought out every curve and detail of each vehicle. This wasn't just a garage, it was a temple to automotive excellence, representing decades of careful collecting and millions of dollars in investments. Every car had been chosen for a specific reason, whether it was historical significance, technological innovation, or simply because Sarah found it beautiful. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant. "The Henderson Charity Gala is tonight. Which car would you like prepared for the event?" Sarah considered her options. The Henderson Gala was one of the most prestigious social events of the year, attended by politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and old money families. It was exactly the kind of event where Marcus Wellington III and Veronica Blackstone would be in attendance, schmoozing with their social circle and pretending to care about whatever cause was being supported this year. "Prepare the Pagani," Sarah texted back. "And make sure Carlos knows I want everything perfect. Full detail, fresh flowers in the cabin, and have the valet service ready at the hotel." As Sarah walked back toward the garage's exit, she paused next to her Honda Civic. The little car looked even more pathetic surrounded by such automotive magnificence, but Sarah felt a genuine affection for the vehicle. She'd bought it during her first year of college, back when she'd been working 3 part-time jobs just to pay for tuition and living expenses. The car had been used even then, purchased from a sketchy lot on the wrong side of town for $1,200 that had represented her entire savings account. That Honda had carried her through some of the most difficult years of her life. It had gotten her to her first job interview at a small investment firm, where she'd started as a glorified coffee fetcher for arrogant executives who treated her like she was invisible. It had taken her to night school, where she'd earned her MBA while working full-time during the day. It had been her transportation to countless business meetings during the early years when she was building her first company, often arriving at upscale offices where the receptionist would assume she was there to clean the bathrooms rather than negotiate million-dollar deals. The Honda represented something that Marcus and Veronica could never understand, the value of working your way up from nothing, of appreciating every step of the journey, and of never forgetting where you came from. Sarah could easily afford to have the car restored or simply replace it with something more befitting her current status, but she chose to keep driving it specifically because of reactions like theirs. It served as a perfect filter, immediately revealing the character of anyone she encountered. People like Marcus saw the car and assumed they knew everything about its owner, that she was poor, unsuccessful, and beneath their notice. They never bothered to look deeper, to consider that someone might choose to drive an old car for reasons that had nothing to do with financial necessity. Their assumptions said far more about them than they realized, revealing their superficiality, their obsession with material displays of wealth, and their complete inability to see beyond surface appearances. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Richard Blackstone's name, and she could already imagine the stress in his voice. She'd been expecting this call ever since Jennifer had filed the acquisition papers that morning. "Mr. Blackstone," Sarah answered professionally. "How can I help you?" "Ms. Chen, I just received some rather surprising paperwork from my lawyers." Richard's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "It appears that your company has been the mysterious buyer we've been negotiating with for the past 6 months. I have to admit, this comes as quite a shock." I was under the impression that Chen Holdings was primarily focused on technology investments. Sarah walked out of the garage and toward her main house, a sprawling modern mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines around the world. The building was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and stone, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape while providing every conceivable luxury and convenience. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered spectacular views of the private lake that occupied the center of her property, and terraced gardens descended toward the water like something from a fairy tale. Chen Holdings has diversified considerably over the years, Mr. Blackstone, Sarah replied as she entered her house through a side door that led directly into her home office. The room was a study in understated elegance, with custom bookshelves reaching to the 15-foot ceiling and a desk made from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood. Real estate has become an increasingly important part of our portfolio, particularly properties with development potential in emerging markets. The truth was that Sarah had originally had no interest in acquiring Blackstone properties until she'd done some research into the family behind the company. What she'd discovered had changed her mind entirely. Richard Blackstone had built his fortune through a series of questionable practices that had displaced hundreds of low-income families from their homes. He'd specialized in buying up affordable housing in gentrifying neighborhoods, evicting the existing tenants through legal technicalities, and then renovating the properties to cater to wealthy professionals moving into the area. The man had become rich by destroying communities, and his daughter Veronica had grown up surrounded by luxury built on other people's misery. They were exactly the kind of people Sarah had encountered throughout her career, those who believed their wealth gave them the right to look down on everyone else, never considering that their own privilege might be unearned or built on questionable foundations. "I see," Richard said, though his tone suggested he was still trying to process this information. "Well, I suppose we should schedule a meeting to finalize the details. Perhaps we could meet at my office tomorrow morning? Actually, Mr. Blackstone, I think it would be more appropriate for you to come to my offices," Sarah said, settling into her leather chair and pulling up the Blackstone Properties files on her computer. "Given the size and complexity of this acquisition, I'd prefer to handle the final negotiations in my own conference room. Shall we say 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could practically hear Richard's mind working as he tried to figure out how a woman he'd never heard of 6 months ago had managed to accumulate enough capital to buy his entire company. The Chen Holdings offices occupied 3 floors of one of the most expensive buildings in the city's financial district, and the meeting rooms there were designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure. "Of course, Ms. Chen," Richard finally replied. "I'll see you at 10 o'clock. Should I bring my daughter? She's been increasingly involved in the family business, and I think it would be beneficial for her to observe these kinds of high-level negotiations." Sarah's smile was invisible but unmistakable in her voice. "By all means, Mr. Blackstone. Please bring Veronica. I think she'll find the experience quite educational." After ending the call, Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the Henderson Charity Gala. The event was being held at the city's most exclusive hotel, a palatial establishment that had hosted presidents, royalty, and captains of industry for over a century. The cause being supported this year was childhood education specifically, providing scholarships and resources for disadvantaged students who showed academic promise but lacked the financial means to pursue higher education. It was a cause that was personally meaningful to Sarah, who had benefited from similar programs during her own educational journey. Her parents had been immigrants who worked multiple jobs just to keep their family housed and fed. The scholarship that had allowed her to attend college had literally changed the trajectory of her entire life, and she never forgot the debt she owed to the anonymous donors who had made that opportunity possible. As the sun began to set over her property, casting golden reflections across the lake, Sarah made her way back to the garage. Carlos, her full-time automotive specialist, had already prepared the Pagani Huayra BC according to her specifications. The car was a work of art that happened to have wheels. Its carbon fiber body had been painted in a deep midnight blue that seemed to shift and change color depending on the angle of the light. The interior was a combination of the finest Italian leather and carbon fiber, with every surface crafted to perfection by master artisans. the Pagani represented automotive engineering at its absolute pinnacle. Its twin-turbocharged V12 engine, hand-built by Mercedes-AMG, produced over 750 horsepower while still managing to rev to nearly 8,000 revolutions per minute with a sound that was nothing short of symphonic. The car could accelerate from 0 to 60 in less than 3 seconds and reach a top speed of over 230 miles per hour, but it was the attention to detail that truly set it apart from other supercars. Every component of the Pagani had been crafted with the kind of obsessive perfectionism that bordered on madness. The gear shifter was machined from a single piece of aluminum and felt more like a piece of jewelry than an automotive component. The air vents were inspired by jet engines and adjusted with the precision of Swiss watchmaking. Even the fuel cap was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to look like a piece of sculpture while functioning flawlessly under extreme conditions. Sarah changed into her evening attire, a custom-made gown by a renowned designer who normally only worked with Hollywood A-listers and European royalty. The dress was a stunning creation in deep emerald green that complemented her complexion perfectly, with subtle beadwork that caught the light when she moved. Her jewelry was equally impressive but carefully chosen to enhance rather than overwhelm, a necklace of perfectly matched pearls, each one worth more than most people's annual salary, and earrings that featured rare-colored diamonds set in platinum. As she drove the Pagani through the city toward the hotel, Sarah couldn't help but appreciate the contrast between this experience and her morning commute in the Honda. The supercar attracted attention at every stoplight, pedestrians stopped to stare, other drivers rolled down their windows to get a better look, and several people actually took pictures with their phones. The car announced its presence with authority, its exhaust note announcing to everyone within hearing distance that something special was approaching. The Henderson Charity Gala was already in full swing when Sarah arrived at the hotel. The valet team, accustomed to handling exotic vehicles, still showed visible excitement when she pulled up in the Pagani. The head valet, a man who had seen every type of luxury car imaginable during his 30-year career, actually whistled softly under his breath as he accepted the keys. "Absolutely stunning, Ms. Chen," he said respectfully. "We'll take exceptional care of her." Sarah made her entrance into the hotel's grand ballroom, a space that had been decorated for the evening with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors. The guest list represented the cream of society, tech billionaires, entertainment industry moguls, political power brokers, and old money families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings throughout the city. She immediately spotted Marcus and Veronica near the bar, both dressed in their finest attire and holding champagne glasses while engaged in animated conversation with a small group of their social peers. Marcus was wearing a tuxedo that had undoubtedly been custom-tailored by one of the most expensive men's shops in the city, while Veronica's dress was a creation of flowing white silk that probably cost more than most people spent on their wedding gowns. Sarah accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and began to circulate through the room, stopping to chat with various acquaintances and business associates. She was a generous contributor to many charitable causes, but she typically preferred to keep her donations anonymous. However, tonight was going to be different. Tonight, she had decided it was time to step out of the shadows and make a very public statement about her priorities and values. Dr. Elizabeth Henderson, the event's host and founder of the educational foundation being supported, approached Sarah with a warm smile. Dr. Henderson was a remarkable woman who had dedicated her life to expanding educational opportunities for disadvantaged students. She had personally overseen the distribution of over $50 million in scholarships and had been directly responsible for helping thousands of young people achieve their academic dreams. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you," Dr. Henderson said, embracing her warmly. "I can't thank you enough for your continued support of our foundation. The scholarship program you've sponsored has already helped over 200 students attend college." "It's been my pleasure, Elizabeth," Sarah replied sincerely. "Education is the great equalizer. It's the one thing that can truly change someone's life trajectory regardless of their background or circumstances. I know that from personal experience. Would you consider addressing the crowd this evening?" Dr. Henderson asked hopefully. "I think it would be incredibly inspiring for people to hear from someone who has achieved such remarkable success." Your story of building a business empire from nothing would resonate with so many of our donors and scholarship recipients. Sarah glanced across the room toward Marcus and Veronica, who were now holding court near the silent auction display. They were examining the various items up for bid: luxury vacations, exclusive experiences, and high-end merchandise donated by local businesses. She noticed Marcus dismissively waving away one of the auction items, apparently unimpressed by a weekend package at what he probably considered a lesser resort. "Actually, Elizabeth, I think I would like to speak tonight," Sarah said, making her decision. "And I'd like to make a special announcement about a new initiative I'm launching." Dr. Henderson's eyes lit up with excitement. "That would be wonderful. I'll make sure you're introduced properly." The program is scheduled to begin in about 30 minutes. As the evening progressed, Sarah continued to mingle with the other guests, but she kept one eye on Marcus and Veronica. She watched as they interacted with the crowd, noting how they seemed to gravitate toward the wealthiest and most influential attendees while barely acknowledging anyone they perceived as being beneath their social status. When a young scholarship recipient approached them to thank donors for their support, Veronica gave the girl a patronizing smile and quickly excused herself to join a more interesting conversation. The behavior was exactly what Sarah had expected, but it still disappointed her. These people had been given every advantage in life, yet they seemed incapable of showing genuine empathy or kindness toward those who were less fortunate. They viewed their wealth as evidence of their inherent superiority rather than recognizing the role that privilege and circumstance had played in their success. When it came time for the evening's program, Dr. Henderson took the stage and delivered a moving speech about the importance of educational opportunity and the transformative power of scholarship programs. She shared statistics about the students who had been helped by the foundation, telling stories of young people who had overcome incredible obstacles to achieve academic success. "Tonight, we have with us someone who embodies the very spirit of what our foundation represents," Dr. Henderson announced. "She is a woman who built one of the most successful business empires in the country from absolutely nothing, starting with just a dream and an unshakable determination to succeed. She has been one of our most generous supporters, though she has always preferred to keep her contributions private. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Sarah Chen, founder and CEO of Chen Holdings." The applause was enthusiastic, though Sarah noticed that Marcus and Veronica looked puzzled by the unfamiliar name. They were whispering to each other, probably trying to figure out who she was and why they hadn't heard of her before. Sarah made her way to the podium with confidence, her emerald gown catching the spotlights as she moved. "Thank you, Dr. Henderson, and thank you all for being here tonight," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. 25 years ago, I was a freshman in college, working 3 part-time jobs and eating ramen noodles for dinner every night because that was all I could afford. I was there because of a scholarship program just like the one we are supporting tonight, a program that saw potential in a young woman whose parents cleaned office buildings for a living. The room had fallen completely silent, with every guest giving Sarah their full attention. She could see Marcus and Veronica in the crowd, both looking uncomfortable as they began to realize that the evening's featured speaker had a background very different from their own. "That scholarship changed my life," Sarah continued. "It gave me access to opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. It allowed me to dream bigger than my circumstances would have suggested. And it taught me that with hard work, determination, and a little bit of help from people who believe in you, there are no limits to what you can achieve." Sarah paused to take a sip of water, using the moment to scan the crowd and make eye contact with various guests. When her gaze fell on Marcus and Veronica, she saw that they were paying very close attention now, though they still hadn't made the connection between the successful businesswoman on stage and the woman they had mocked in traffic that morning. "Over the years, I've been blessed with extraordinary success in business," Sarah said. "Chen Holdings now manages over $15 billion in assets across multiple industries. We employ thousands of people around the world, and our companies have created products and services that improve millions of lives every day. But none of that success means anything if we don't use it to help others climb the same ladder we were fortunate enough to ascend." The applause was building now, with several guests nodding in appreciation of Sarah's message. She could see Dr. Henderson beaming with pride, clearly thrilled that one of her major donors was finally stepping into the spotlight to share her story. "Which brings me to tonight's special announcement," Sarah said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. Chen Holdings is establishing a new scholarship fund with an initial endowment of $100 million. This fund will specifically target students from low-income families who show academic promise but lack the resources to pursue higher education. The gasps of amazement were audible throughout the ballroom. $100 million was an extraordinary donation, even by the standards of this wealthy crowd. Several guests actually applauded spontaneously, and Sarah could see people turning to their neighbors with expressions of disbelief and admiration. "But that's not all," Sarah continued, raising her hand to quiet the applause. "I'm also announcing the acquisition of Blackstone Properties, a real estate development company that will now be redirected toward creating affordable housing for students and low-income families. We believe that everyone deserves access to safe, clean, affordable housing, regardless of their economic circumstances." This time, the silence in the room was different. Sarah could see several guests turning to look at Veronica, whose face had gone completely pale. The Blackstone name was well known in social circles, and everyone in the room understood the implications of what Sarah had just announced. Richard Blackstone had been forced to sell his company, and the buyer had just publicly stated her intention to use it for purposes that were completely opposite to its previous mission. "Change is never easy," Sarah said, looking directly at Veronica as she spoke. "Sometimes we have to challenge our assumptions about success, about wealth, and about our obligations to others. Sometimes we have to look beyond the surface of things and recognize that true worth isn't always visible from the outside." Marcus was staring at Sarah intently now, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place where he might have seen her before. Veronica was gripping his arm tightly, her knuckles white with tension as she processed the reality of what had just happened to her family's company. "I want to close with a personal story," Sarah said, deciding it was time to drive her point home completely. "This morning, on my way to work, I was stopped at a traffic light in my old Honda Civic. Yes, I still drive the same car I bought in college 25 years ago. Another driver pulled up beside me in his expensive Porsche and spent several minutes mocking my vehicle, making loud comments about how pathetic it was and speculating about the kind of person who would drive such an embarrassing car." Marcus's face went white as the memory came flooding back. He remembered the rusted Honda at the traffic light, remembered his cruel comments, remembered laughing with Veronica about the poor woman who was driving such a piece of junk. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he actually stumbled backward a step. "That driver made the fundamental error of judging a person's worth by their possessions," Sarah continued, her voice remaining calm and professional even as she delivered this devastating revelation. "He assumed that because I chose to drive an old car, I must be poor, unsuccessful, and beneath his notice. He never considered that I might have reasons for my choice that had nothing to do with financial capability. He never imagined that the person he was mocking might actually own a collection of supercars that would make his Porsche look ordinary by comparison." The crowd was mesmerized now, hanging on every word. Several guests had turned to look at Marcus, who was clearly in shock. Veronica was frantically whispering in his ear, probably urging him to leave before the situation got any worse. "The truth is, I drive that Honda because it reminds me of my journey," Sarah explained. "It keeps me grounded and humble. It helps me remember what it felt like to struggle, to work for everything I had, to appreciate every opportunity that came my way. Most importantly, it reveals the true character of the people I encounter." Sarah paused again, letting her words sink in. The ballroom was so quiet that you could hear the crystal chandeliers tinkling softly in the air-conditioning breeze. "You see, when someone looks at my old car and assumes I'm not worth their time or respect, they're telling me everything I need to know about their values and their character. They're revealing themselves to be exactly the kind of people who judge others by superficial appearances rather than taking the time to discover who they really are." Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Several people near him had clearly figured out that he was the unnamed Porsche driver from Sarah's story, and their expressions ranged from disapproval to outright disgust. In their social circle, being exposed as someone who mocked others for their perceived poverty was almost as bad as being caught cheating on your taxes. "But here's what I want everyone to take away from tonight," Sarah said, her tone becoming more encouraging. "Success isn't about the car you drive or the clothes you wear or the neighborhood you live in. Success is about using whatever advantages you've been given to help others who haven't been as fortunate. Success is about building something meaningful, creating opportunities for others, and making the world a little bit better than you found it." The applause this time was thunderous. Guests were standing, clapping enthusiastically, and several people were actually wiping away tears. Sarah had delivered a masterclass in grace, power, and social awareness, turning what could have been a moment of petty revenge into a profound lesson about values and character. As Sarah left the podium and returned to the crowd, she was immediately surrounded by admirers eager to congratulate her on both her donation and her speech. Business cards were pressed into her hands, invitations to exclusive events were offered, and several prominent philanthropists expressed interest in collaborating on future charitable initiatives. Marcus and Veronica, meanwhile, had quietly slipped away from the crowd and were making their way toward the exit. Sarah caught sight of them just as they reached the ballroom doors, and for a moment, their eyes met across the room. Marcus's expression was a mixture of shame, embarrassment, and something that might have been respect. He gave her a small nod, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of the lesson he had learned tonight. Veronica, however, looked furious. The loss of her family's company was bad enough, but being humiliated in front of their entire social circle was apparently unbearable. Sarah suspected that she would be hearing from the Blackstone family's lawyers very soon, though there was nothing they could do about a completely legal business acquisition. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and business discussions. Sarah found herself committed to several new charitable initiatives and had made connections that would prove valuable for both her business interests and her philanthropic goals. By the time the event was winding down, she had raised an additional $50 million in pledges for Dr. Henderson's foundation. As Sarah waited for the valet to bring her Pagani around, she reflected on the evening's events. The revenge against Marcus had been satisfying, certainly, but it wasn't the most important part of what had happened tonight. More significant was the opportunity she'd had to publicly commit to using her wealth and success for positive purposes. The Pagani pulled up to the hotel entrance with its characteristic rumble, immediately attracting a crowd of admirers despite the late hour. Sarah tipped the valet generously and settled into the car's perfectly crafted interior. As she drove home through the quiet city streets, she found herself thinking about the students who would benefit from her scholarship fund, the families who would have access to affordable housing through the reformed Blackstone properties, and the ripple effects that her actions tonight would create in the years to come. When she arrived back at her estate, Sarah parked the Pagani in its designated spot in the garage and walked over to her Honda Civic. The little car looked even more humble surrounded by automotive excellence, but Sarah felt the same affection for it that she always did. Tomorrow morning, she would climb back into the driver's seat and head into the city for her meeting with Richard and Veronica Blackstone, probably encountering more people along the way who would judge her based on her choice of transportation. But that was perfectly fine with her. The Honda would continue to serve as her filter, helping her identify the Marcus Wellingtons of the world while also reminding her of how far she had come and why her success mattered beyond personal gratification. It was a humble car with an important purpose, and Sarah had no intention of retiring it anytime soon. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that made even mundane activities feel special. Sarah performed her usual morning routine, a workout in her private gym, a healthy breakfast prepared by her personal chef, and a review of overnight reports from her various business interests around the world. The markets in Asia had performed well, her European holdings were showing strong growth, and her tech companies were on track to exceed their quarterly projections. At precisely 8:30, Sarah climbed into her Honda Civic and began the drive to her downtown offices. The commute took her through several different neighborhoods, from the exclusive residential areas near her estate to the rapidly gentrifying districts closer to the city center. As always, she noticed the reactions of other drivers and pedestrians to her vehicle, most of them dismissive or pitying, though a few seemed genuinely curious about why someone would choose to drive such an obviously aged car. The Chen Holdings headquarters occupied floors 30 through 32 of the prestigious Millennium Tower, a glass and steel monument to corporate success that housed some of the city's most powerful companies. Sarah's private elevator whisked her directly to the 32nd floor, where her executive offices commanded spectacular views of the city skyline and the harbor beyond. Jennifer was waiting with her morning briefing, along with copies of several newspaper articles that had appeared overnight covering the Henderson Charity Gala. Sarah's speech and donation had made front-page news in the business section, with several journalists praising her commitment to educational philanthropy and social responsibility. One particularly astute reporter had even managed to track down information about the Blackstone Properties acquisition, connecting the dots between Sarah's speech and Veronica's obvious discomfort during the evening. "The Blackstones are scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock, Jennifer informed her. "I've prepared the large conference room on the 31st floor, and I took the liberty of having our legal team review all the acquisition documents one final time. Everything is in order for the closing." Sarah spent the next hour reviewing the Blackstone files, familiarizing herself with every detail of the company's operations, assets, and liabilities. Richard Blackstone had built his fortune through aggressive tactics and questionable ethics, but he had also assembled a substantial portfolio of properties in prime locations. With proper management and a completely different philosophy, Blackstone Properties could become a powerful force for positive change in the community. At exactly 10 o'clock, Jennifer announced that the Blackstones had arrived. Sarah made her way to the conference room, where she found Richard and Veronica already seated at the massive mahogany table that dominated the space. The room itself was designed to impress, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and original artwork by renowned contemporary artists adorning the walls. Richard Blackstone was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of deep tan that came from spending winters in Palm Beach and summers in the Hamptons. His suit was impeccably tailored, and his demeanor projected the confidence of someone who had spent decades making deals and accumulating wealth. However, Sarah could see the stress lines around his eyes and the tension in his posture that betrayed his current circumstances. Veronica sat beside her father, dressed in a conservative business suit that was probably intended to make her look serious and professional. However, her hostile expression and rigid body language made it clear that she was here under protest. She had obviously recognized Sarah from the previous evening's events, and her anger was practically radiating across the conference table. "Ms. Chen," Richard said, rising to shake hands as Sarah entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us here. I have to admit, your offices are quite impressive." "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone," Sarah replied professionally. "Please, have a seat. I believe we have quite a bit to discuss regarding the transition of your company's operations." Sarah took her place at the head of the conference table, with her legal team arranged on either side. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. This was clearly her domain, and the Blackstones were here as supplicants seeking the best possible terms for their surrender. "Before we begin," Veronica said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Your little performance last night was completely inappropriate. You publicly humiliated my family and made private business matters into some kind of morality play for your own entertainment." Sarah looked at Veronica calmly, noting the young woman's defensive posture and hostile tone. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Ms. Blackstone. However, I believe you may be misremembering the sequence of events. I was publicly mocked and humiliated first, by someone who made assumptions about my character and worth based solely on the appearance of my vehicle. My speech last night was about the importance of not judging others by superficial appearances, a lesson that I thought might benefit everyone in attendance. You manipulated the situation," Veronica accused. "You could have identified yourself at any time, but instead you chose to set up some elaborate trap to embarrass Marcus and make yourself look like a victim." Richard placed a restraining hand on his daughter's arm, clearly recognizing that her aggressive approach was unlikely to improve their negotiating position. "Veronica, perhaps we should focus on the business at hand," he said quietly. But Sarah was interested in pursuing this conversation. "Ms. Blackstone, do you believe that I should have to justify my choice of transportation to strangers at traffic lights?" Do you think I owed your friend Marcus an explanation for driving a car that he found aesthetically displeasing? That's not the point, Veronica replied, though her voice had lost some of its initial venom. The point is that you deliberately deceived him about your circumstances. I deceived no one, Sarah said firmly. I simply drove my car and minded my own business. Your friend chose to make loud, public comments about my vehicle and speculate about my personal circumstances. I didn't invite his attention or his judgment. The fact that his assumptions turned out to be incorrect is entirely his responsibility, not mine. The room fell silent for a moment as Veronica processed this response. Sarah could see the young woman struggling with the cognitive dissonance between her initial outrage and the logical reality of the situation. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I think it's worth examining why you're so upset about this incident. Are you angry because Marcus was embarrassed, or are you angry because you shared his assumptions about people who drive old cars? Are you upset about the public nature of the revelation, or are you upset because it forced you to confront some uncomfortable truths about your own prejudices? Veronica's face flushed red, and for a moment Sarah thought she might actually storm out of the room. Instead, the young woman seemed to deflate slightly, her anger giving way to something that looked almost like shame. I think, Richard said carefully, that we all learned some valuable lessons last night. Perhaps we could focus now on ensuring a smooth transition for the company and its employees. The next 2 hours were spent reviewing contracts, discussing operational changes, and establishing timelines for the company's transformation. Sarah outlined her vision for Blackstone Properties' future, explaining how the company would shift from luxury developments that displaced existing communities to affordable housing projects that strengthened neighborhoods and provided opportunities for low-income families. I want to be clear about something, Sarah said as the meeting neared its conclusion. This isn't about punishment or revenge. This is about taking a company with valuable assets and talented employees and redirecting it toward purposes that benefit society as a whole. Everyone who wants to be part of this new mission will have a place in the organization. Richard nodded thoughtfully. That's very generous of you, Ms. Chen. I have to admit, when I started this company 30 years ago, I was so focused on maximizing profits that I never really considered the broader impact of our developments on existing communities. Perhaps it's time for a different approach. What about the employees who don't want to be part of this new direction? Veronica asked, her tone now more curious than hostile. They'll be offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new positions, Sarah replied. I'm not interested in forcing anyone to work for a company whose mission they don't support. But I think you might be surprised by how many people will embrace the opportunity to do work that has genuine social value. As the Blackstones prepared to leave, Veronica approached Sarah privately. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. Not just for this morning, but for yesterday as well. Marcus was completely out of line, and I should have told him to stop instead of encouraging him. Sarah studied the younger woman's face, seeing genuine remorse where there had previously been only anger and defensiveness. I appreciate that, Veronica. It takes courage to admit when we've made mistakes. I've been thinking about what you said about judging people by appearances, Veronica continued. I realize that I've probably missed out on knowing some remarkable people because I made assumptions about them based on superficial things. That's not the kind of person I want to be. Then change, Sarah said simply. You're young enough that your character isn't set in stone yet. You have the opportunity to become the person you want to be rather than the person your circumstances have shaped you to be. After the Blackstones left, Sarah remained in the conference room, looking out at the city sprawling below her offices. The meeting had gone better than she had expected, particularly Veronica's apparent willingness to engage in genuine self-reflection. Perhaps there was hope for the younger generation after all. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Ms. Chen, this is Marcus Wellington. I got your number from a mutual friend. I wanted to apologize for my behavior yesterday morning. There's no excuse for what I said, and I'm genuinely sorry. If you're willing, I'd like to take you to lunch and apologize in person. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, considering her response. She could simply ignore it, or send a brief acknowledgement and leave it at that. But something about the tone of the message suggested that Marcus's embarrassment had led to genuine reflection rather than just wounded pride. "Mr. Wellington," she texted back, "I appreciate your apology. However, if you truly want to make amends, I'd suggest you consider making a donation to the Henderson Foundation instead of buying me lunch. Actions speak louder than words." His response came within minutes. "Already done. I donated $50,000 this morning and signed up to volunteer as a mentor for scholarship recipients. The lunch invitation stands if you change your mind." Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. Perhaps Marcus was capable of growth as well. She made a mental note to follow up with Dr. Henderson to verify the donation, but something about Marcus's response felt genuine. The rest of Sarah's day was filled with the usual array of meetings, phone calls, and strategic decisions that came with running a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. However, she found herself thinking frequently about the events of the past 24 hours and what they revealed about human nature, social dynamics, and the responsibility that came with extraordinary success. That evening, Sarah returned home to find her property manager waiting with a report about some proposed improvements to the estate's security system. As they walked around the grounds discussing camera placements and access controls, Sarah's attention was drawn to the garage where her car collection was housed. "Carlos mentioned that you might be interested in adding to the collection," the property manager said, following her gaze. "There's a Barrett-Jackson auction next month with some exceptional vehicles coming up for sale." Sarah nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. The collection represented millions of dollars in automotive excellence, each vehicle a masterpiece of engineering and design. Yet the car that had sparked the most meaningful conversation of her recent memory was the humble Honda sitting in the corner, looking completely out of place among its exotic neighbors. "Actually," Sarah said, making a decision, "I think I'd like to add something different to the collection this time. See if you can find me some interesting examples of ordinary cars with extraordinary stories. A taxicab that served a major city for decades, maybe, or a pickup truck that helped build something important. Cars that worked hard and made a difference in people's lives." The property manager looked puzzled but nodded professionally. "Of course, Ms. Chen. I'll start researching some options." As Sarah walked back toward her house, she realized that her perspective on her collection was changing. The supercars were beautiful and impressive, but they were also, in many ways, just expensive toys. They sat in climate-controlled perfection, admired but rarely driven, appreciated for their rarity and value more than their utility or meaning. The Honda, on the other hand, had stories to tell. It had carried her through struggles and triumphs, witnessed her tears and her victories, been a faithful companion through the long journey from poverty to prosperity. It had character in a way that none of her exotic vehicles could match, earned through years of service rather than crafted by Italian artisans. That night, Sarah called Dr. Henderson to discuss the scholarship fund and the foundation's plans for expanding its programs. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from application procedures to mentorship programs to long-term sustainability. By the time they finished, Sarah had committed to not only the original $100 million endowment but also to serving on the foundation's board of directors and taking an active role in selecting scholarship recipients. "You know, Sarah," Dr. Henderson said as their call was ending, "what happened at the gala last night is going to have ripple effects far beyond just the money you donated. The story is already spreading through social media and news outlets. People are talking about the importance of not judging others by appearances, about using wealth responsibly, about staying connected to your roots even as you achieve success. You've started a conversation that needed to happen." Sarah went to bed that night feeling more satisfied than she had in months. The revenge against Marcus had been gratifying in its own way, but the larger impact of the evening, the donations raised, the awareness created, the conversations sparked, felt far more meaningful. She had used her moment in the spotlight to advance causes she cared about and challenge people to think differently about success and social responsibility. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as the Blackstone Properties acquisition was finalized and the company's transformation began. Sarah worked closely with Richard to identify properties that could be converted to affordable housing, while also developing plans for new construction projects that would serve low-income families without displacing existing communities. Veronica, somewhat surprisingly, asked to remain with the company during the transition. She expressed interest in learning about socially responsible development practices and requested assignment to one of the affordable housing projects. Sarah agreed, partly out of curiosity about whether the young woman's apparent change of heart was genuine. Marcus, true to his word, not only made a substantial donation to the Henderson Foundation but also began volunteering as a mentor for scholarship recipients. Sarah heard through mutual acquaintances that he had been profoundly affected by his public embarrassment and was making genuine efforts to examine his own privileges and prejudices. 3 months after the charity gala, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her, and Marcus and Veronica were hosting a fundraising event for a local homeless shelter, and they specifically requested her attendance. The invitation included a personal note from Marcus: "I want to show you that some people can learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves." Sarah decided to attend the event, curious to see how Marcus and Veronica had channeled their experience into positive action. The venue was modest compared to the luxury hotel that had hosted the Henderson Gala, but the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. The guest list included social workers, community activists, and people who had been helped by the shelter's programs, along with some of Marcus and Veronica's society friends who seemed genuinely engaged with the cause. When Sarah arrived at the event, she chose to drive her Honda Civic rather than one of her exotic cars. The decision was partly practical. Parking was limited and she didn't want to worry about her Pagani being damaged in a crowded lot, but it was also a test. She wanted to see how Marcus and Veronica would react to seeing her in the same vehicle that had sparked their initial encounter. As she pulled into the parking lot, Sarah noticed Marcus immediately approaching her car. His expression was warm and welcoming, with no trace of the disdain he had shown months earlier. He actually waited for her to park and then opened her door with a respectful smile. "Ms. Chen, thank you so much for coming," he said sincerely. "I have to tell you, seeing this car brings back some uncomfortable memories, but also reminds me of one of the most important lessons I've ever learned." "How so?" Sarah asked, curious about his perspective on their shared history. "That morning when I mocked your car, I was showing everyone exactly who I really was," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "I was revealed as someone who judged people by their possessions, who felt superior because of circumstances I hadn't earned, and who was willing to be cruel to strangers for my own entertainment. It wasn't a pretty picture." Sarah was struck by the honesty of his self-assessment. "And how do you see yourself now?" "As someone who's still learning," Marcus said humbly. "The scholarship recipients I've been mentoring have taught me more about real success than I learned in 4 years at Harvard Business School. These kids have overcome obstacles I can't even imagine, and they've done it through pure determination and hard work. Being around them has shown me what genuine accomplishment looks like." Inside the venue, Sarah was impressed by the thoughtfulness of the event's organization. Instead of the typical charity gala format with lengthy speeches and formal presentations, Marcus and Veronica had created opportunities for guests to interact directly with shelter residents and staff members. There were stations where people could learn about the root causes of homelessness, volunteer opportunities with local service organizations, and displays showing the concrete impact that donations would have on the shelter's programs. Veronica approached Sarah during the reception, looking nervous but determined. "I wanted to thank you again for the conversation we had after the acquisition meeting," she said. "You challenged me to think about the kind of person I wanted to be, and I've been taking that challenge seriously." "How so?" Sarah asked, noting the genuine warmth in the younger woman's expression. "I've been working on the affordable housing projects, but I've also been volunteering here at the shelter," Veronica explained. "I spend 2 evenings a week helping with their job training program, and I've learned so much about the circumstances that can lead to homelessness. It's not what I expected at all." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I thought it would mostly be people who had made bad choices or who weren't trying hard enough to improve their situations," Veronica admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I had no idea how many people are just one medical emergency or job loss away from losing their housing. Or how many of the residents are actually employed but can't afford rent on minimum wage jobs. Sarah nodded approvingly. Those are important realizations. What are you planning to do with that knowledge? Well, the affordable housing projects are one piece of the puzzle, Veronica said, her voice becoming more animated as she discussed her work. But we are also looking at ways to provide job training and placement services, financial literacy programs, and support systems that help people maintain stable housing once they have it. It's much more complex than I initially understood, but also more rewarding. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by the transformation she was witnessing. Marcus and Veronica had clearly moved beyond simple guilt or embarrassment to develop authentic concern for social issues and effective approaches to addressing them. Their society friends, many of whom had probably attended the event out of social obligation, seemed to be genuinely engaged with the cause and the people they were meeting. During the program portion of the evening, Marcus took the stage to address the crowd. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that I would be standing here talking about homelessness and social responsibility, I would have laughed at them, he began. I was someone who thought that success was measured by the car you drive, the clothes you wear, and the neighborhood you live in. I was completely wrong. He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes met Sarah's. I was taught a very important lesson by someone who had every reason to write me off as hopeless but instead chose to show me a better way to think about wealth, success, and our obligations to each other. That lesson changed my life, and I hope the work we're doing here tonight will help change some other lives as well. The applause was enthusiastic, and Sarah found herself genuinely moved by Marcus's words. This was clearly not a performance or an attempt to rehabilitate his image, it was the reflection of someone who had undertaken serious self-examination and emerged as a better person. After the event, as guests were beginning to leave, Veronica approached Sarah one final time. I have a confession to make, she said quietly. I've been driving my father's old pickup truck to the shelter for my volunteer work. It's nothing fancy, but it feels more appropriate than showing up in my BMW. I'm starting to understand what you meant about your Honda. Sarah smiled at this revelation. It's not about driving an old car to prove a point, Veronica. It's about being comfortable with who you are regardless of external circumstances, and about not letting material possessions become the primary way you define yourself or judge others. I'm still learning that lesson, Veronica admitted. But I think I'm making progress. As Sarah drove home that night in her faithful Honda, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a moment of casual cruelty at a traffic light. What had started as a simple case of judging someone by appearances had evolved into a complex story of growth, redemption, and social responsibility. The revenge she had initially sought had been satisfying, but the lasting impact of the encounter had been much more significant. Two people who had been trapped by their own prejudices and privileges had been forced to confront their assumptions and had chosen to become better versions of themselves. They had used their wealth and influence to address real social problems, and they had inspired others in their social circle to do the same. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Henderson, the scholarship applications for next year are already 30% higher than last year, and we are getting inquiries from students all over the country. The story of your speech has really resonated with people. Thank you for using your platform so effectively. Another message came from her property manager. I found some interesting vehicles for your collection. There's a 1985 checker cab that served New York City for 20 years, a mail truck that delivered to rural communities for 3 decades, and a school bus that transported kids safely for over 400,000 miles. Let me know if any of these interest you. Sarah smiled as she read the message. These vehicles had stories to tell, just like her Honda. They represented service, dedication, and the unglamorous but essential work of keeping society functioning. They deserved a place of honor alongside the exotic supercars that had been crafted for beauty and performance. As she pulled into her estate and drove through the magnificent gates, Sarah thought about the strange circularities of life. She had started her journey in a modest car, achieved extraordinary success, accumulated the finest vehicles money could buy, and yet found herself most attached to the same humble Honda that had carried her through her struggles. The car wasn't just transportation, it was a reminder, a teacher, and a filter all rolled into one. It kept her connected to her past, challenged her to remain authentic in the present, and helped her identify people's true character regardless of their social status or apparent sophistication. Over the following months, Sarah continued to drive the Honda for her daily commute while using her exotic cars for special occasions and weekend enjoyment. The contrast never failed to amuse her, and she collected stories of people's reactions like a sociologist studying human behavior. Some people, like Marcus and Veronica, learned important lessons from their encounters with her. Others remained trapped by their prejudices and assumptions, missing opportunities to connect with someone who might have enriched their lives or advanced their interests. The Honda continued to serve as an effective sorting mechanism, helping Sarah identify the people worth knowing and doing business with. A year after the Henderson Gala, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on corporate social responsibility. Her speech, titled The View from a Honda Civic, What Driving an Old Car Taught Me About Success, became one of the most watched business presentations of the year. The core message that true success comes from using your advantages to help others rather than simply accumulating more advantages for yourself resonated with audiences around the world. The Blackstone Properties transformation had become a model for other companies seeking to balance profitability with social impact. The affordable housing developments were not only providing quality homes for low-income families but were also generating steady returns for investors, proving that doing good and doing well were not mutually exclusive goals. Marcus's mentorship program had expanded to include dozens of volunteers from the business community, and several of his scholarship recipients had gone on to start their own companies with social missions. Veronica had been promoted to head the affordable housing division and was being courted by other organizations seeking her expertise in socially responsible development. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the ongoing conversation that Sarah's story had sparked about wealth, privilege, and social responsibility. Business schools began incorporating her case study into their curricula, asking students to examine their own assumptions about success and consider their obligations to the broader community. The Honda Civic, now with even more miles on the odometer and a few additional dents from city driving, continued to serve faithfully as Sarah's daily transportation. She had received countless offers from car collectors and museums who wanted to acquire the vehicle that had become famous through her speeches and interviews, but Sarah always declined. The car had earned its retirement, but it wasn't ready to become a static display. It still had work to do, stories to tell, and lessons to teach. As long as there were people who judged others by superficial appearances, as long as there were assumptions to challenge and prejudices to confront, the humble Honda would continue to serve as Sarah's mobile classroom and social laboratory. On quiet Sunday mornings, Sarah sometimes took the Honda for long drives through different neighborhoods, observing the city's diversity and complexity. She would pass mansions and apartments, luxury car dealerships and bus stops, private schools, and public parks. Each neighborhood told a story about opportunity, circumstance, and the American dream in all its variations. During these drives, Sarah often thought about the scholarship recipients who were now attending college because of the foundation she had established, the families living in safe, affordable homes because of the Blackstone Properties transformation, and the homeless individuals who had been helped by the shelter that Marcus and Veronica now supported. These were the real measures of her success, not the cars in her garage or the numbers in her investment accounts, but the lives that had been improved through the responsible use of her wealth and influence. The Honda had been the catalyst for this broader transformation, a humble vehicle that had sparked conversations, challenged assumptions, and ultimately helped create positive change in the world. It was, Sarah realized, the most valuable car in her collection, not because of its monetary worth, but because of the lessons it had taught and the good it had inspired. As she drove home from one of these reflective Sunday journeys, Sarah's phone rang with a call from a journalist who was writing a follow-up story about her charitable work. "Ms. Chen," the reporter asked, "do you ever regret not revealing your true wealth to those people who mocked your car? Don't you think it would have been more satisfying to see their immediate reaction?" Sarah considered the question carefully as she guided the Honda through her estate's gates. "The immediate reaction would have lasted a few minutes," she replied. but the longer journey of self-discovery and growth that followed has lasted more than a year and will hopefully continue for the rest of their lives. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is helping someone become a better person, even if they don't realize that's what you're doing. And with that thought, Sarah Chen pulled her faithful Honda Civic into its space in the garage, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of automotive excellence but secure in the knowledge that this humble car had accomplished something far more valuable than speed or beauty could ever provide. It had taught profound lessons about character, challenged destructive assumptions about worth and success, and ultimately helped create a more just and compassionate world. The Honda's engine ticked quietly as it cooled, ready for whatever lessons tomorrow might bring.